Hey there, you guys. Irene Lyon here. Welcome to this video, to this YouTube channel, and to this world of healing trauma, nervous system health, and all things neuroplasticity. I have a question here today from the social media world, and it's going to get into I'm going to call the 3 things we need to know when we are on this healing journey. And there are many healing journeys. It could be healing trauma, it could be just healing lifestyle, chronic stress. But what I've learned in my work over the last 20 plus years is that there's sort of these key factors, key foundations that we always have to have in place. And so this will get into those as well. So here's the question from Courtney. Courtney writes, I have been doing this work for 6 months and have found myself in a state of anxiety and panic this week after months of what felt like boredom and quiet. That's very key. Deep down, I feel like I'm on track. So that's really good, number 1. I feel ready to release this, although it's not a perfect process and the fresh anxiety has surprised me. How do you move through new, and then she has in brackets, or very old anxiety without getting overwhelmed? So Courtney, this is a great question because you're already, I think your spidey senses know that this fresh anxiety is actually meant to come up and out. So the first thing that we have to understand when we're doing any type of healing work with the human system, and we're learning this more and more as we move forward in time, is that we cannot disconnect body from mind, from environment, from circumstance, from history. It all comes together. And the one thing that we often don't understand is that anxiety, at least in the field that I work in, which is the somatic trauma healing fields, the work of Peter Levine, Kathy Kane, these sort of new pioneers in the new traumatology, is that anxiety is not anxiety per se, it's stored survival stress. I'll say that one more time. It is stored survival stress. When it is biological, this is different than mind-based, we often call it anxiety, which might be kind of that FOMO, that fear of missing out, that anxiety that we put upon ourselves with rumination and mental thoughts that just don't serve us. That is different than this biological anxiety that feels like your heart is going to burst out of your chest, or the gut is clenched, this worry that makes you sweat, that makes your hands sweaty, that makes you want to, dry heave when you have to talk to someone. Those are biological responses. So if we think about anxiety in that way, this stored survival stress, what it is old sensation, old fight and flight energy. I've done more videos on this. I'll post a few of the more beginner videos below so you can review those if you are new here. So it's this stored fight flight, the sympathetic nervous system, which is part of the autonomic nervous system. It is that energy, that desire to protect, to get out of the way, to run, to flee, and even maybe to hide. It is that stuff coming up and out. So if we've had, let's just say, a terrible childhood, which is so common for so many people that are watching these videos, which we know due to the ACE study leads to chronic illness, mental illness, a whole host of problems, adrenal fatigue, autoimmune, cancer, heart disease, you name it. I'll post some of the ACE study links below as well. So if we've grown up with this unsafety, this inability to grow our capacity to be with intense emotions and sensations and difficulties and challenges, and we weren't taught from our primary caregiver how to self-regulate, how to calm down naturally, with time, with support, with safety, all these things that human beings, mammals really, need to release intensity. If we didn't get that from day one, what will happen is it gets stored up inside of us. Time doesn't let these things just pop out on their own. They get stored up. This is what's called the freeze response or the shutdown response, part of the parasympathetic. I did another video on the polyvagal a little while ago. Be sure to check that out because that gets into these different branches. So if we've had bad stuff that has occurred to us and we did not have the modeling, the teaching, the wherewithal to know what to do with these intense survival energies, fight, flight, they get stored inside. And then here's what happens. As we age, as we become more intelligent and wise, and we want to heal this stuff, which I'm assuming many of you want, these little gremlins start to find their way to the top, kind of like a bubble coming up from the surface of a water, right? Down in that, if you think about the ocean, there's all these gases and beings and things in the murky, murky, dark parts of the depths of the ocean, and they create energy and they release things and they travel to the surface and then pop up onto the top into the air. And in some ways, that's what's occurring in our system when we've had stuff pushed down for so long, literally depressed. And then we start to be more aware of these things. We start to get in our body because these scary things disconnect us from our body. As we start to wake up our body, we will feel these survival strategies, anxiety, which in my world is really just survival stress, fight, flight energy, desperately trying to get out. So that is the first thing that you have to understand, is that when you get into this healing practice deeply within the body, with the system on board, you have the intention to work at this deep neurophysiological level, we may feel, as you're saying here, as Courtney's saying, boredom. It used to be boredom and very quiet. My guess is that boredom and quiet was a little bit of the shutdown response, that you were living in this deep state of freeze. This is a deep part of the parasympathetic nervous system, part of our vagus nerve, that puts us into shutdown, that puts us into low metabolism. It hides us from the world so that we don't feel the intensity around us. So it kind of numbs us, literally. If we go into shock after a big accident, we want to be numbed out so that we don't feel the pain, right? Imagine you have a broken bone, something really terrible that's more of a shock trauma. You want your system to pump out the chemicals to put you into a shutdown state so that you can preserve your sanity in a way. That's okay for once in a while, and then we of course heal from that. But if we grew up in a situation, as I just mentioned, where it wasn't safe, where we weren't taught how to handle our intensities, our emotions, what occurs is we just default to this shutdown response, this biological freeze response to preserve our sanity, to preserve our biology, etc. The thing is that over time, our biology starts to get broken down because we can't live in that freeze response. It will turn our system into a lot of toxicity, and this is what breeds chronic illness. I have another video I will post regarding that below. So to go back to the question here, this makes sense that when you've been doing this for, you've said, about 6 months, you start to feel more of these survival stresses bubbling up to the top. The system has been dormant, it's been shaken up, and they're normal. Here's the thing. Healing trauma is not just about release. So this is the next piece. This is where education is super duper important. We want to build capacity. And this would be kind of the next thing to understand, is that if you think about it, if your system has been shut down, you haven't been feeling, we've been avoiding maybe stressful situations because we just know deep down that we can't handle intensity. Our system doesn't have that resiliency. If this has been the case, our capacity is very small. And I use an analogy in one of my series, my healing trauma series. I'll pop that below too. It's a 3-part video series, totally free. You can check that out if you haven't watched that. But I have this analogy of a swimming pool that has a lot of beach balls in it. And when we've had a lot of traumatic stress and we haven't healed and regulated our nervous system, we live with a very small swimming pool. Imagine a small swimming pool with lots and lots of beach balls crammed inside. For me, those beach balls are the past stresses, the past fight, flight, freeze responses, all trapped inside. So when you have this pool with all these balls, the system can't function. It feels stressed, it feels taxed. So the thing that it does is it shuts down. It almost ignores the fact that it's got all this stuff stuck inside. As we start to bring more awareness to our body system, to our mind, to our thoughts, to our sensations, our emotions, we start to realize there's this weird bubbling of anxiety coming to the surface. We are basically shaking up that pool a little bit, and the pool is asking us, or the system is saying, hey, we want to take some of these things out. It's time. And while that might seem like a release, sometimes these things occur in a way that doesn't even feel like a release. And there's been this kind of concept in our world of trauma healing that to have a release means you've got to have this big shaking experience or this big cathartic emotional outburst where you use a whole box of Kleenex. And that's not always the case. It can come out as heat. It could come out as your immune system doing a bit of a flip. It could come out with the digestion kind of going a little wonky. It can come out with just sadness. It can come out as feeling grief, feeling despair. It can come out with tears, or it might just be tears that have no emotion. So there's all these different ways that our system moves those balls out, but there isn't one way. So often I find people get a little confused where they're looking for this big release and then it's done with. And that, for the most part, like 99.99999% is never the case, at least in our current world right now, where we have stored trauma, early trauma, developmental trauma, surgical procedures, conditioning, societal conditioning, all the things that we have lived through as humans. It isn't as simple as just shaking it out and then moving on. So to go back to this question, just to review, this person is asking, Courtney is asking, what is going on? How do I move through this old or seemingly new anxiety without getting overwhelmed? And this leads to the next thing. It leads to growing capacity, because this work is kind of trial and error. There's no do this first, this first, this first, and then you're done, and then that's it, and you can, never think about it ever again. It's kind of like exercise or diet. You don't just do a good meal once or have a really good workout once, and then you're done and you're good for life. I hope that makes sense. This work, what we're seeing, myself, my colleagues, my students, it is lifestyle, it is lifelong. And there's beauty to that, because it means that we don't have to try to get it all done in one time frame. So to avoid, or to, I'll say, cope better or be with the overwhelm, build capacity. So in other words, rather than just noticing your body when you're feeling really anxious and you're feeling those fight-flight responses, notice your body when you're not in that state. Notice your system when you're having a talk with a good friend, or you're having a laugh watching a movie, or you're drinking a really nice cup of tea or a glass of wine, or you're on a stroll with your kids, or you're playing. Connect with what your body feels like in those moments, when there's goodness, when there's joy, and notice what that feels like, that expansion, because that expansion is what we want to keep when we start to feel these flutters. But because of our brain and because of our history and because of us thinking of these flutters as bad, get rid of them, depress them, we shrink, we shut our capacity down. I hope I'm making sense there. Think of that pool. It's like it goes from here to phoom. So if you want to practice, one way is to start noticing the physiology in the body in times that are better, in times that are less bad, when there's a little more joy, when there's a little more relaxation. That's number one. The other way to build this capacity so that we're less overwhelmed when these little bubbles come up is to actually notice the littler stresses throughout our day. So let me give you a few examples. To me, stress is not necessarily a bad thing. The body is put under a bit of stress when we go up a flight of stairs. Our heart rate goes up. It's put into a little bit more if we might be driving in traffic and all of a sudden we forget our exit and we get a little panicked. There's so many examples. So maybe think of some yourself, maybe write some down after this video. When we can see these more benign stressors in our life that are not threatening and harmful, like exercise or a little oops when we're driving, or maybe you stub your toe on the coffee table. I do that myself. If you can pause in those moments and feel the increase in intensity, feel the heart rate go up, maybe you feel you get a little flush, maybe you feel all of a sudden you shut down. Everyone's got a different survival strategy based on their history. Some people have a heart rate that might go up. Other people might just go into shutdown and numb it all out. Or some of us have a combo of a little bit of both, depending on the situation. So when you have these little minor stresses that occur, that is a perfect time to practice being in the body, feeling the sensation, staying connected to the environment, to yourself, to your breath, not changing the breath. Because if we change the breath, we cope and manage that stress, and that doesn't allow it to release naturally. Hope that makes sense. I'll post another article below on why it can be counterproductive to deep breathe when we are stressed and working through these little bubbles. So to review, the question was from Courtney, I've been feeling really quiet and kind of calm, and since this healing work has been happening, there's been more what is termed anxiety come up, and she wanted to know, what do I do with this overwhelm? How do I move through this? How do I release it? The main key factors to know is that number one, anxiety is just a word, but really you want to understand the biological reasons for that. In the work that I do, it is this fight, flight energy coming up, bubbling up to the surface because it's been depressed and stored inside for so long. So this is good. I'm going to pause on that. It's good when you're doing this work and you haven't felt this. I know this might seem super crazy, but if you have just felt numbed and really none of this intensity throughout life, this means that the system is starting to defrost. It's starting to let things out, but we also don't want to overload the system. So with that, obviously get education on board so you know what's going on. And then be sure that when these things come up, you feel them, you sense them, you stay connected, and you find ways to practice feeling the body in times that are good, when you're resourced, when there's joy, when there's something that's just benign and everyday. Notice the body when the system is not in overwhelm. The more that can happen, the more you build that capacity, you increase that swimming pool that I talked about, and it actually allows the balls to come out a little easier. If you think about it, if you have a swimming pool with lots of balls packed, it's hard to get them out because they're so jammed. So as we increase the capacity to be with our system when things are good, it jiggles things a little bit so things can come out. And then of course, finally, think of ways, or notice ways, I should say, in daily life where you get a little spike in stress, and notice what occurs and be with it. Practice. You've got to practice these things. And what you might be surprised with is that over time, over weeks, months, years, just these subtle practices can start to create capacity so that when you do feel that old stuff come up, because it will come up, when those things start to come up, you know what to do. You don't freak out. You don't put more survival stress into the system, and then they do truly release, and then they truly integrate, and then your system has even more capacity because you've taken that out of the body, out of the physiology. All right, I know I've mentioned a lot of other resources in this video. I will, like I said, post them below, take some time to go through them. Titrate the learning. It's also important to titrate this learning because as you learn this education, my hope is that you're feeling this through your system, and just doing that alone will make a big difference. Thank you so much for being here, and we will see you next time.